Hi, Misha here, and in the first part or half, looking back at Chinese military aircraft, we kind of looked at the designs that were more or less indigenous. For example, the J8, the JH7, the J10, and the J20 and J31 of modern times. In this one, we're going to kind of look back at more or less copies. And so we have on the far left the Shenyang J5, which is a copy of the MiG-17. Then we have the Chengdu J7, which is a copy of the MiG-21. And then we get into the Sukhoi copies. These are all Shenyang. Here we have the J11B, and this is a copy of the SU27. Here we have the J15, which is more of a reverse engineered than a true copy of the SU33. And likewise, we have the J16, which is somewhere between a copy and a reverse engineered SU30 two-seater. And then finally, we have an actual SU35. This is the E variant for export, which China purchased from Russia, although they were fitted with Chinese avionics and other equipment. And this actually has really helped them progress their own programs. The two small models are from Hobbymaster, and the rest again are from Air Force One. All of them are 1/72 scale diecast. And with that, let's just talk a bit about each one. So we begin with the J5, the Chinese Shenyang produced MiG-17. And this used the same NATO reporting name, Frisco, as the Russian, and a few different types are in Chinese service. So let's go back to the early mid-50s, pretty much right after the Korean War. China acquired several of the early generation unradared kind of whatnot. The Chengdu J7, Allied NATO reporting name Fishcan. I don't know why, but I think it's kind of funny. And this dates back to the early 60s, right as the MiG-21 was coming around. It was when the original Sino-Soviet split happened towards the end of 1960. But then in 1962, things kind of thawed early in the year. In fact, Khrushchev invited a Chinese delegation to tour the MiG factory, something they knew could be one of those too good to be true things, but still couldn't pass up. So they sent their very best, including essentially the commander of the Air Force, who himself had graduated from a Russian academy back during the Korean War period or before, over, and they toured the factory for days, and a deal was signed where Russia would provide the MiG-21F to China. They were supposed to ship over parts and drawings But the Chinese were still wary. Nevertheless, they accepted the deal, and it turns out they had a right to be. What they received late that year in lots of crates wasn't the best. The blueprints, the drawings were incomplete. Much of the tooling wasn't there, and many of the parts they received from Russia were subpar, out of spec, or otherwise just not right. Luckily, they'd already kind of started thinking about how to reverse engineer the MiG-21F. So the planes they did purchase from Russia and assemble from Russian parts were originally known as the Type 1962 or T-62 fighter. And then they started trying to make plans to do their own. And they claimed that they found over 200 problems with the Russian plans. Keep in mind, again, it's an early MiG-21. And they set out to correct them. Now, originally, this was all at the Xinjiang factory, much as the prior J5 had been. But some of the planned changes, improvements they wanted to make didn't happen, at least not right away. They did strengthen the airframe, which, well, made it stronger, but this also meant that it was a little less maneuverable, a little more sluggish in the air. They also had some issues with manufacturing the engine, which is kind of an ongoing thing. And just their aerospace industry couldn't quite do everything they'd hoped for. Nevertheless, the first Chinese-made example was ready in 1965, and then flew in 1966. But then the Great Cultural Revolution was underway, and this really stalled the program out. They did build a couple of dozen of the original J7, as they were known, some for their own use, some for export. Then they did make an improved version in the late 60s known as the J17I, or Roman numeral 1, I'm not sure which. And this would lead on, after over a decade, to the J7 Roman numeral 2. And this finally, by the 1980s, is when they start to have success. They produce over 147 of the kind of second generation, or really third generation. And also manufacturing had been transferred to Chengdu in the late 60s, early 70s. They improved the engine and ended up adopting more and more advanced radar, more weapons compatibility. They started being able to accept first wing tanks and then later center line tanks. They also added an extra cannon, 30mm cannon at some juncture. And with the J3, they kind of went into full production. But let's go back to the J2 or J7-2 for a minute. They built them in the 80s, and this was the first one that really matched the Russian MiG. Before that, the Chinese just wasn't quite up to snuff. The problem is, in 1991, they discovered with the J7-2s that the engines, while they had better performance and less fuel consumption, had been producing more heat, which had damaged many components. So they had to pull the fleet in that year, or in 1992, I should say, and then refit them, rework them, and this became the J7B. And from there and there, the J7C was an upgraded J7 III, as was the D. These would introduce new features like true fire control, radar, and then even look down, shoot down capability. And from there, they would have the J7E and J7M, which would further improve it. The aircraft, like the MiG-21, is just under 49 feet long, has a wingspan of around 37 feet, is capable of Mach 2, at least later versions, so certainly as an upgrade from the J5. It would either have one or two cannon, had a total of 4 hard points under the wings. They could carry each about 1,100 pounds. They could carry rocket pods, as on this model, drop tanks, or guided missiles. And they made just a slurry of versions and variants, and this actually became quite an export success under the F7 name. For example, they sold some to Egypt, which is actually part of the reason they ended up with some MiG-23s from Egypt to help develop later aircraft in China. And they were still actively using it, actively still making it well into the 90s. In fact, it really didn't enter into full Army Air Force service until the 80s. In the 70s, production was just so low rate, it didn't matter, and the aircraft were kind of substandard. So it wasn't until the mid to late 80s that the J7 really entered. And it was mostly used for local air defense or tactical patrols. By this point, this was an outdated aircraft, and they knew it. But the hope was if they had enough of them, they could basically spam the enemy, just overwhelm them with numbers, because it still was capable in the sense that it had a radar, it could do missiles, it was reasonably fast, and the range was okay for a local air defense. In fact, this model is purportedly from Hobbymaster to be a nighttime defense patrol version from 1997. And again, they would keep making new models and even introducing new models like the J7G into the 21st century. And production would not be concluded until 2013. So they produced these for nearly 50 years, even if the first 2 decades are pretty low rate. And they would end up turning out over 2,400, maybe even 2,500 of these. So they definitely did spam them. As to the model, like I said, it has some issues. It's a nice model. Hobbymaster makes a good MiG-21. You have a pilot in the cockpit. You have removable ordnance. You have gears. It's primarily metal. Comes with a good stand. But essentially what they did is they took a MiG-21 biz and they gave it Chinese markings. And really a J7 is an improved MiG-21F, although depending on which version, yeah, I've seen some places mark this as a J7, others as a J7-II, some as a J7C, and even others as a J7D. So it's kind of hard to pin it. Yeah, it's not the most advanced later versions, which it would be completely wrong for, but I think instead of just remarking the MiG-21 biz, they should have maybe taken a little extra effort. And what's funny is, a short time after this model came out, they did a MiG-21 PF, and they did a fantastic job with it, going to the early missiles, the early nose cone. I don't know, it's funny. But either way, it's a nice model, and it's nice to have a MiG-21 with Chinese markings. But I wish they had put a little more effort into, like, the physical changes. At any rate, even today, the Army Air Force still has around 200 in inventory, even if they're very much kind of second-line local defense. And even the Chinese Navy has between 30 and 50 that they use. So even though it's a MiG-21, it's still very much in service, although in much upgraded versions from what you would have found, say, in the Vietnam War. And the transfer of tech from Shenyang to Chengdu is important because of later Chengdu aircraft that we talked about in the first video. And it kind of shows. With that, let's move on to some bigger aircraft. Now we're back to Shenyang and the J11. Specifically, this is the J11B. As to the A, well, the name J11 actually dates back to the very late 70s as they were starting to get back on track in China. This is when they were working on the J8 and all that. It was to be a replacement for the J7 and more capable version, but it really went nowhere. Fast forward till after the Cold War in 1996, the Chinese government reached an agreement with Sukhoi in Russia to produce 200 Su-27 SK model variants in China using kits supplied by Russia. So they would have Russian engines, avionics, radars, basically just assembled in China. And so the program began in 1998, and at the end of that year, the first, as it was known, J11 flew. And from that time, Shenyang would build them up. And all was well until 2002, when the Chinese unveiled an improved model that they claimed to be both lighter and stronger, made with more composite materials, to feature a glass cockpit, improved helmet display, other things. Also, the original Su-27 SK was an air superiority fighter. Their new Chinese derivative was supposed to be more of a multi-role fighter. And at first, Russia kind of took this with aplomb. In fact, Sukhoi offered to upgrade their license to produce the modernized Su-27 SK. But in 2003, Shenyang would terminate the original J7 production, having built just over 100 aircraft from kits, deciding to switch to their version, which purportedly featured domestic stuff like a domestic engine known as the WS-10 and domestic radar. Of course, as you would imagine, these are copies of the Russian systems. And at first, Russia seemed to accept this. Now, that meant the original version was retroactively kind of named the J11A, with the new version, the J11B. And it is obviously still very close to a Sukhoi. It's about 72 feet long, has a very good size wingspan, dust, of about 48 feet. It's capable of Mach 2.1, and it can climb to about 65,000 feet. And it has an internal 30mm cannon and a total of 10 hardpoints. Many under the wings, and then we have 2 under each engine intake, and then we have the 2 kind of in the tunnel under the fuselage. Now, like the Su-27, it was mostly meant to carry air-to-air missiles, be it short range on the wingtips or medium to long range underneath. But with the upgrade, it could carry iron bombs, basically free-fall bombs, rocket pods, and a few other air-to-surface munitions. Although it doesn't seem like it had much ability to carry a guided anything. The first of these was delivered to the Chinese Army Air Force in 2006, but they did have problems, mostly to do with the domestic-made engines. As I've kind of commented on and off throughout these videos, the Chinese jet engine was kind of their Achilles heel. So it really wouldn't be till 2009 that they started to really produce these in numbers and start to put them into service. And we first see them being used on exercise in 2011 near and around Pakistan. And by now they're pretty much in full use. And originally Russia was okay with this, but around 2010 they began an investigation and essentially accused China of ripping off their technology, because while they had a license to produce 200 from kits, they did not have a intellectual property license to remanufacture things, again, like the engines, the avionics, the radar, what have you, not to mention sell them. To date, Shenyang has built at least 250. 104 of the original J11As were built. Many of them have been updated to the J11B standard. Plus another 95 purpose-built J11Bs have been constructed to date, as far as we know. And even the Chinese Navy has gotten in on the game a bit. And they operate around 40 or 45 of these, probably from, well, it had to be from land. But anyway, the Army has some. So there are well over 200 in service. And it is a pretty long-range aircraft. But it is based on the SU-27 and reverse-engineered technology. So it does have limitations. Yeah, but it was a step in the direction for the whole family, we'll see. Speaking of, they would construct a 2-seat trainer version known as the J11BS. And they would also work on a navalized version known as the J11BH. Although I don't believe that made it much past the initial testing phase. Could be wrong on that. But yeah, they had some issues with the WS-10 engine, especially early on. Now they seem like they've pretty much worked its performance out. And again, they claim to have made a better airframe than the original. But this kind of shows China ripping off Russian intellectual technology property. And even though in the beginning this was really pre-Putin and then early days of Putin, once he really solidified his power, he tried to go after China. And was a little successful. We'll talk about that when we get to the other models here. But yeah, this is a nice one from Air Force One. It is of the Chinese derivative. It has the ordnance. Very, very heavy. Even the Pt.II tube is metal on this, which I like. It does have gear stuck in the down position, but they do have rolling wheels, so that's nice. And it has a closed canopy. Yeah, it's pretty much all metal, which is nice. And as I pointed out in the first video, these come with very nice stands. They have the name of the aircraft. So I'm just spinning this around to get it out of the way. And they're held together with a nice kind of thumb screw, so you can take them apart. And they just slot in using 2 holes. My only complaint is they do set high, so these aircraft end up needing to kind of go on the top shelf. But nice stand. Overall, I actually like it more than the Hobby Master. If I had one complaint, I wish the stem were adjustable, or if they gave you maybe a short stem and a tall stem, just so maybe you could actually fit it on your shelf. But even these Sukhois, the Hobby Masters, what have you, they're hard to get on shelves. It is a massive aircraft. The MiG-29 was kind of the local tactical light aircraft. Well, this was the big, long-range, more strategic-minded aircraft. They're so cool. I like the Sukhois. They're neat. With that, let's move on to the next version. The J15, sometimes called the Flying Shark, often referred to as the Chinese copy of the Sukhoi SU-33. which is kind of true. In the early 2000s, right about the same time that China pulled the stunt with the J11B, they did approach Russia asking for production or a license for the SU-33. A lot of, a lot of problems though. Money had a lot to do with it. Sukhoi was kind of upset, of course, about what they did. Also, they pointed out that the SU-33 was out of production, and they would need at least an order for 50 to start the production line again. China countered that the SU-33 was very much a fourth-generation jet and would be obsolete within a couple of decades, so they really didn't want to buy more than, 15 to 25. Talks fell apart. At the same time, China's aircraft carrier, Liaoning, which is now in service with its sister ship, started off as something China purchased from Ukraine, and that's a whole story in and of itself. But with the carrier, almost as an afterthought, a bonus, Ukraine tossed in a prototype Su-33 known as the T-10 Model K3. This is just how Russia numbers prototypes. So they did have an early version to kind of base it off of. And as I said a minute ago, they had a navalized version of the J11, the BH, that they had worked with. So they kind of combined the two, the T10 and the 11BH, to come up with the J15. And this program kind of got kicked off around 2006. And the first prototype flew in 2009. And then it started having simulated carrier landings and whatnot in 2010. And then in 2012, it had its first real successful carrier takeoff and landing trials. But it wasn't without controversy. So what do we have here? Well, it's the same dimensions as the other one, really. But now we have 12 hard points instead of 10, which is to be true with the Russian. We also have these canards to help with the short takeoff and landing from carriers. Still have two WS-10 engines. We have, of course, a tail hook in the back. The J15, of course, can carry air-to-air weapons. It can also carry quite a wide range of anti-shipping missiles. And it can carry some air-to-surface guided munitions as well, so more of that ability. And, of course, for carrier operations, it does have folding wingtips. Boop, like that. Which, of course, the Russian plane has too. And it has reinforced landing gear for carrier operations. So just, navalized version, basically. The problem, in 2013, it became apparent that the aircraft, while it could carry quite a large weapons payload, and it could carry a decent amount of fuel, it was really impossible for it to take off from a carrier fully armed and fully fueled. It was too heavy, too big, too heavy. So there had to be a compromise. Either it had to be relatively lightly armed or not much fuel on board. And so this received a lot of criticism. Nevertheless, production was pushed ahead. It was officially adopted at the end of 2013, and an order was placed to arm Liaoning. And in 2016, the first of these would go on their cruise with the carrier. And of course, that would be China learning how to operate a carrier, frankly. Sea trials and operating this aircraft and all of that. but it never really left its issues behind. By 2018, there had been 4 crashes, many to do with the whole weight issue, and again, continued criticism. The Chinese Navy's response was, well, it still outclasses other fighters in the region, except for, some U.S., but they kind of intimated that it was still better than Russians. And it does have a glass cockpit and some other modern features. That said, it was always to be an interim solution until a new, better 5th generation carrier aircraft came along. And at this time, it looks like it might be the J31, although it could still be the J20 if they modify it, or maybe even something else. Hard to say. But they had produced 20 from the Shenyang factory, and that seems to be it. Again, it gave their carrier something relatively modern. They did come up with an updated version, the J15B, that had upgraded engines and some other advancements to try to help. But in the end, this doesn't seem like an aircraft destined to serve for all that long. And much like the SU-33 in Russia, which also had low production numbers, it's trying to kind of rework an airframe that was not intended for carrier operations into something it just really isn't optimized for. It's big, it's heavy, and they're operating these ski jump carriers. They're quite large, but obviously they're smaller than American carriers, and this is a large aircraft. I mean, compare it to the F-35C, or even the FA-18 or FA-18 Super Hornet. Yeah, it's just kind of, big. So, yeah. But yet again, it is China copying Russia. Although less of a direct violation, except for what came from the J11B program. This model here, I know I could have picked up a Hobbymaster one, but I thought since my other aircraft were Air Force One, it would be nice to kind of match them up. Plus, this one does have the folding wings. The Hobbymasters do not. And I just think that's kind of neat. Otherwise, it's like the others. Metal stand here. Rolling gear. And pretty much all metal construction. Even the wings are metal. Plus the tail. It's neat. And it really completes the fleet. And I have a model of the Liaoning from Forces of Valor. So it's nice to see the plane in larger scale versus the little 1/700 scale J15s that come on it. And with that, let's move on to kind of our final Chinese copy of a Russian. And now we come to the J16. This is considered a multi-role strike fighter. And is one of the newest in this line. It is essentially a 2-seat J11B, sort of. China did acquire some of the Sukhoi SU30 MKK variant, also at least a couple of the SU30 MK2 variant, and they seem to have combined reverse engineering with these and the base J11B, specifically the BS 2-seater, and this is what they came up with. This is to kind of partially replace the aging JH7 in the ground attack role, but it's also intended to be a longer range interceptor if needs be. It can carry quite a wide range of air-to-air and air-to-surface guided munitions. It has the WS-10A engine, 2 of them. It's a little bit longer than the standard, but not by much. About the same wingspan and about the same performance, and it has a total of 12 hard points under the wings, and it can carry reconnaissance equipment too. And even though they had the original J11BS and a couple of the SU30s for a while, evidence of this really didn't surface till early 2012. And then it was into Army Air Force service by 2013, and they actually seem to have a few built by 2014. And was officially acknowledged as being in service by 2017, although really wasn't combat ready, at least fully so, up until 2018. And by now, it's in service. How many have they built? Well, some sources say 128 or more. Some sources say last year, too, that they were given radar absorbing, so stealth paint coating, but this is of dubious effect. I mean, it might help a little tiny bit, but the airframe is in no way stealthy, so yeah, it's probably just as much a propaganda thing as anything else. But yeah, this kind of completes the lineup, with the original J11 being the more or less standard fighter, the J15 being the navalized version, and this being the strike version. And this is pretty current in China. It's not their most modern aircraft, as you saw. The J20 and perhaps the J31 are that, but those are very new, 5th generation. This is more tried and tested technology, even though it does have quite a modern radar and targeting system. It's very much 4th generation. If you're being really generous, 4.5 generation. But it's cost effective. They can use existing tooling at Xinjiang to produce it. It uses a tested engine. And it helps phase out some older ground attack aircraft, like I said, like the J17. And this model is like the rest. Rolling wheels, pretty much all metal construction. And it comes with a nice metal stand with its name on it. I just mostly picked it up because they were available on these Air Force One models. If you buy them right, are not very expensive, really. And they're kind of fun. They're not perfect, but they do represent some lesser-known aircraft. And again, this is not a SU-30 clone, not exactly. It's definitely inspired by it, but it has other elements as well. And with that, we do have one more aircraft to talk about before I let you go. And we end today with the Sukhoi SU35E. And this is actually not an unlicensed Chinese copy. Not yet, anyway. It's a fun story. The SU-35 is really Russia's most advanced in-service aircraft. Yeah, there's the SU-57, but the SU-35 is actually in service in numbers. And this is, of course, based on the tried and tested SU-27 airframe. And it goes all the way back to the 1980s, when they tried to make the SU-27M, and they made, I think, over a dozen of them, and this was to be a multi-role version of the SU-27, but they were really just starting to test it out in the late 80s when the USSR fell apart. So the program was shelved, and this happened a lot. This is also what happened with the SU-33, or rather its predecessor, the SU-27K. But it was revived around 2003 as Russia was expanding its military again. It was coming out of an economic crisis. Putin was in power, and Sukhoi used modern technologies, kind of adopting much from other planes that suited them. And by 2009, 2010, they had an airplane that was, an inter-testing service. And by 2015, the first Russian order was fulfilled. Originally, they were going to get 48. This was actually up to 100 as Russia was kind of rearming. And they had their combat debut for Russia in 2016 over Syria. Well, the Chinese were also interested. Surprise, surprise, because this is more technology. It has a new engine with thrust vectoring. As you saw, the model has an all-moving tail, which is kind of neat on this model. Still very much the Sukhoi pattern. A little bit longer wingspan, about 50 feet. And a little bit longer because there's no pitot tube. There's a longer radome for a more powerful radar. So it's about 72.5 feet long. So slightly longer, slightly heavier. It does have more stealthiness. It's not a stealth aircraft, but it has more stealth capabilities. It is definitely kind of a culmination of a fourth generation. Let's call it a 4.5 generation fighter. It still retains a 30mm cannon, 12 hard points. It's capable of at least Mach 2.2, maybe a little faster. And yeah, it's a multi-role aircraft. It has air-to-air, air-to-surface, laser-guided, all the new wonderful things. And China was interested. In fact, they were pretty much interested as soon as Russia started working on it. But again, in 2010, things were a little rocky, but this got smoothed over and talks began. About 2012, there was a bit of an impasse. Sukhoi was understandably nervous that China might copy this and, unlicensed. And it probably didn't help that every time the Chinese got anywhere near the engines or the radar, they started physically drooling. That really was what they were really interested in. The airframe's not all that special. And so to kind of help offset this and lower the risk, Sukhoi, really the Russian Export Board, but we'll just say Sukhoi like we've been saying, insisted they buy at least 48 or 50. Big enough order, at least they'll make money. Keep in mind, economically, Russia's economy is pretty stagnant, and this would really help them. And China wasn't willing. They said, look, this is essentially an interim measure. It's still old technology. There's newer things. Of course, they pointed to America's F-35 that was starting to come online then. And, of course, French's new Dassault fighters, the Rafale. Eventually, the Kremlin stepped in, i.e. Putin, and ordered them to lower the order, and they negotiated for 24. And after the first contract was filled for Russia, they began working on the Chinese contract. And this would make China the first export customer, for the SU-35, hence the E. And because the Chinese ended up with the upper hand despite past experiences, they even kind of twisted the screws a little further. Russia would make quite a bit of money selling avionics and stuff, all the other cockpits, all the essentials. But China said, no, we have these, ours are better. And eventually they won out. So not only did Russia only sell 24 planes, they weren't even complete planes. They had some systems that would be provided by China and installed there. So this was the SU35E with some Chinese components and localizations. So yeah, but again, China had the money, Russia needed the business. There you go. So the first 4 were delivered in 2016, and then the next 10 in 2017, and then the final 10 in 2018. In that year, the first squadron formed and started training with these. It was declared operationally ready and began patrols. And also that year, the U.S. sanctioned China for having done business with Russia after all the Crimea stuff. And China pretty much shrugged and went, we've been sanctioned before. And Russia went, hey, China, you want more of these? So in 2019, they offered them an additional contract to purchase more Su-35s. I'm not sure if they ever took them up on this. I couldn't really find at a glance if it was indicated. But China did say from the get-go that they hoped this would be the last imported fighter. They hoped after this they could stick to strictly domestic designs and production, again, like the J20 and J31. So this was always meant to be an interim solution, really, as all of these we looked at in this video have been. That said, the 24 Su-35s acquitted themselves well, and China was very happy to see the latest in Russian weapons and radar and thrust vectoring engines, and I'm sure it's a complete coincidence that the newer versions of the WS-10 engine have thrust vectoring. Yep, I'm sure. But now it does seem like Russian-Chinese relations are better than they have been in quite some time. So who knows where this will lead to. And the Su-35 is a very capable aircraft, be it in Chinese or Russian service. Not cutting edge, but very capable. Now, just this year, back in September, the internet, excuse me, guys, I've been talking for a while. Sound like Joe Biden, Jesus. Anyway, the internet was abuzz with an Su-35 that purportedly crashed in Taiwan. You might see the problem. The Taiwanese said, no, we didn't shoot anything down. It was a crash, mechanical. Luckily, it seems like China accepted this, but there was accusations for a time that the Taiwanese Air Force shot down a Chinese Air Force aircraft. If that had been borne out, as so many internet rumors said, that would have been very bad. Luckily, Taiwan labeled this as fake news. China didn't pursue it. And it's also purported that the pilot did eject and received proper medical treatment in Taiwan. I need to look up that story and see how it's progressed since then. I haven't really looked at it in a while. But that did get a Chinese Su-35 in the news. But with everything else going on, I think it probably got overlooked. This is just an interesting aircraft because of all the Sino-Russian relations. We started this video off talking about them, and we're kind of ending talking about them. And it is, again, a very capable, very solid multi-role aircraft. And I'll be interested to see if China purchases more or builds more under license or builds more not under license. And finally, this model is from Air Force One, as the others. This does have an opening canopy. And it has fixed ordnance. As you saw, it has moving tails. Interestingly, because of the more patterned surface, this is lighter than the others. It has more polymer in it. It's one of my lighter Air Force Ones. but we won't hold it against it. It's neat that at least they do make it. Hobbymaster also makes a superb Sukhoi. But I've got one of those in Russian guys, so I thought getting one of the export models to represent China would be fun. And it comes with a stand. And yay, they maybe listened to me. I know they didn't hear me, but anyway, they went to a lower stem. So this is actually easier to get on a shelf. It's a little bit lighter of a stand too, smaller base, but that's okay because again, the model's a little bit lighter. I think they kind of did it to simulate the stealth coatings. And because, well, let's be honest, it's cheaper and this is a newer model. In the world of diecast, the older you go, the heavier they seem to be because, well, they were cheaper to produce back then. But again, this one was only like 35 bucks, and I thought, why not? I bought it on sale. So really, these aircraft tell a story of relations between China and Russia from the early 50s through present day. And it's quite interesting. You know, with the original J5 MiG-17, things were quite good, and Russia was sharing pretty advanced technology and really helped China leap forward. And they flew these aircraft, especially as trainers, up through the 80s. But then with the J7, the MiG-21, things fell apart. There was a bit of a effort for reconciliation, but then they kind of fell apart again. And then the Cultural Revolution really showed how the Chinese aviation industry, even military, lost a whole generation. From the mid-60s up through the late 70s. Not much happened, and so they had to play catch-up in the 80s, and that's why they ended up having to rely on the J7 really up to this very day, but especially in the 80s. And really why even the J8 was so behind schedule. And that really directly leads into the J11. This was a way to get their hands on cutting-edge technology about a decade late. The J11, based on the SU35E SK, would have been great if it happened a decade earlier, but it didn't. Nevertheless, it was able to introduce the Chinese industry into a next generation from what they had before. Because if you look at the J8 and the JH7, they still have kind of that old look to them. But with this, you see newer aircraft, even like the J10 coming out. But unfortunately, this also kind of soured relations again because of how China handled it. But despite that, they were able to make the J15, thanks in part to Ukraine, into their own engineering. But it really was an interim aircraft at the best of times, and even received criticism from the Chinese media, which, as you know, is pretty radical. Doesn't happen too often. The J16 is newer and seems to be doing better. There's not a lot of fuss from Russia on this. I think the J11, bygones be bygones and whatnot. And even though this is another kind of interim solution, it's less so. It's a more capable aircraft at launch and seems to be doing well. But since it's only been in service a couple of years, we really don't know. There's not a lot out there on this plane. And then now the SU35E. It's quite interesting. This, of course, was an effort for China to get yet another look at newer Russian tech, but also tech they could understand, they knew about, they were familiar with. So we'll see where this goes. Now, one thing to point out, when they were really negotiating for the SU-35, the Chinese military, mostly, of course, the Army Air Force, but Navy too, had about 3,000 planes. Of those, 1,700 or so were classified as fighters, but of those, a good chunk were old. They were the J7 or the J8, as well as the JH7. Not all that many were new, like even the J10. And of course, when they were negotiating for the SU-35, the J20 was just barely out of its infancy, and the J31 was even further behind. So this really was an effort to finally retire older aircraft. And before, China had kind of done the quantity over quality approach. Just have a bunch of outdated but numerous fighters, like I said earlier, spamming them. But it seems like with the newer aircraft, they are going to more of the quality. Maybe a smaller Air Force, but with more modern aircraft. And to that end, they have entered the 5th generation. In fact, technically, they had a 5th generation fighter before Russia, and they produced more of them to date. So this really is showing a pretty successful effort in China to modernize. And that's why I kind of like doing videos where everything is together, to really show the lineage, the history. Individually, it's probably easier to watch and easier for me to record, but I think something is lost when you take something out of context. I think something like the SU-35 here especially is more interesting when you understand why they did it, why Russia let them, why China wanted it, and just the whole history. But China is good at copying, and they're not even bad at improving, at least incrementally, what they copy. So it'll be very interesting to see how their Air Force progresses as 2020s go along. Certainly the U.S. should not be complacent. And this has also led to kind of more military buildup in the region. Japan comes to mind. They're operating their first aircraft carrier since World War II. Of course, South Korea and Australia are vigilant. And of course, Taiwan especially has a major stake. So it's definitely a military region in the world. So something to be observed. And that's really why I like models. It's a connection to history and just something fun, yet still there are things to learn. So let me know what you think. Which of these is your favorite? Or do you not like any of them? Or you like them all? Again, the Hobbymaster are probably the highest quality. And I think they did a very good job with the J5. I think the J7 really, anyway, I said earlier, the Air Force Ones are neat for being low-priced, heavy-duty metal. They're obviously not as high quality, and they don't have the options like the Hobbymaster, but, you know, that's not always a bad thing. Well, I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help out, you might go over and check out the main Mishaco channel. I'm sure you have, but just in case you haven't, we do have some Chinese guns over there too to go along with the aircraft. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.